Hey, this is Philip Ekberg, and you're watching Getting Started with ASP.NET Core and OAuth. In this final module, we're going to talk about using hosted OAuth providers with ASP.NET Core. We'll see how we can move across from using Identity Server to use a third party like Auth0. The knowledge we gain throughout this module is something that we're going to be able to apply even if we're using services like Stormpath, Amazon Cognito, or other OAuth providers. We're going to see how it changes the behavior when we authenticate with our application, as well as when we validate that you are authorized to use our API. Throughout the module, I want you to think about the security implications that this could have on your current system, especially if you allow people to register using your third-party OAuth providers. In this demo, we're going to introduce Auth0 for authentication. We'll see how we can, inside our Auth0 account, specify our client that is going to be our website. The website will then be able to use Auth0 for all the authentication. It'll allow us to log in, register as a new user, as well as using social logins like Google, Twitter, Facebook, and Microsoft. And this will give you an idea of how easy it is for us to apply all the knowledge that we have about OAuth into a new web application or existing web application where we want to migrate away from things like Identity Server or simply introduce a better practice for authentication and authorization. Up until now, we've been using our own authorization server. In some cases, though, you might be working with third-party systems like Auth0, Stormpath, or Amazon Cognito. All of these different providers allows us to use OAuth and OpenID Connect. Just as we've been doing with our authorization server, we can use these different providers to provide authentication and authorization for our APIs. So what I've done here is that I've set up an Auth0 account. I'm using a free trial account here, and we'll be setting up a new client inside the Auth0 dashboard, as well as specifying our API. And then we'll make sure that our application, which is our website, knows how to talk to Auth0 to provide authentication, and then we'll change the API so that it uses Auth0 to validate that we are authorized to access our APIs. So let's go ahead and create a new client before we replace our authorization server in our project. We'll create a new application in Auth0, and I'm going to call this Social Network. This here is a regular web application. We can also specify here that this is one of these particular applications. And interacting with Auth0 is a little bit different depending on what type of application that you're building. Just as with our authorization server, if we build a single page app, a mobile application, or if we're using a web application that we've been looking at in our examples. So let's choose that we're using a regular web app. This here sets everything up that we need in order for us to get started with authentication in our application. We can even read through the different quick starts to get information about how to build this in different applications. We can look at the ASP.NET Core application to get information about how to build this into our app. And this here tells us how we can use Auth0 as the authentication provider for our website. So the first thing that it's telling us, of course, is to install these two different packages, but we already have everything inside our website that we need in order for us to get started. So let's head back to the top here and check the settings. And this here will give us all the different things that we need to know in order for us to get started. It tells us the authority, which in this case is the domain. It tells us the client ID as well as our client secret. So let's jump into Visual Studio and set this up to use Auth0. We can start off by unloading our OAuth project, because we're no longer going to use that inside our application. Just to make sure that it's not confusing, we're going to replace our authorization server with Auth0. So let's go into the web project and into the startup file. And the parts that we are going to change here is our OpenID Connect options. So let's get rid of the options that we've been using for our own authorization server and add the ones that we are interested in for Auth0. So the first option that we want to set is the authority. The authority lets us point to our authorization server, which in this case is going to be Auth0. Next up, I'm going to specify our callback path. This is where the middleware will allow us to listen for the callbacks coming from Auth0. So as we've talked about previously, both our authorization server as well as Auth0 is following the OAuth 2 specification as well as OpenID Connect. It specifies what kind of data that is passed both to the authorization server as well as what we can expect to get back from one of these authorization requests. And our middleware here will allow us to listen for that response coming back from Auth0. So we'll set up the callback path to be something unique. So once we've authenticated with Auth0, we'll be redirected back to our website /sign-in-OAuth0. It's as simple as that. And then we'll just specify that we don't require SSL. And we'll set up our client ID in secret. And remember, these values is available in the settings panel inside our Auth0 dashboard. I'm also going to tell it to save the tokens, which will save that in the properties sections of our cookies. And then we can set up the response type as well as the scopes that we are requesting from Auth0. And remember earlier when we talked about response types, we can set this to ID token, which will give us the identity token. We can set it to code to use the authorization code flow, which will get a code from the authorization server and trade that for an access token. So we'll be trying to use the same hybrid flow that we've talked about earlier and we've used in our previous demos to get both the ID token as well as trading our code for an access token. And then we'll request a few different scopes. We're going to request the same scopes that we did earlier. We're going to request social network, which is our API, and we're going to request OpenID as well as offline access. Alright, so what we have now is that we have our OpenID Connect options. It's pointing to Auth0, it's telling us where to go when we've authenticated at Auth0, and then we're of course also specifying the client ID, which is required for the authorization part, and then we are also adding the secret, which is used together with the client ID to trade the code for an access token. Before we run this, there's one more thing that we need to specify. We need to say what kind of signing scheme that we're using for this authentication middleware. And just as we've done earlier, we are going to use cookies as the scheme for our authentication. So now let's run this here and see what happens. So we have our website running here, and I'll click About here at the top and we'll see what happens. You can see at the top here that it's doing an authorization request. It's passing the client ID and the request URI and a little bit more of information. So let's look at that in just a moment. But this page here tells us that we are not using one of the approved callback URLs. So we need to head back to Auth0 and add this callback URL to allow us to use this here for authentication. Before we do that, let's jump into Fiddler and have a look at the actual request that was passed on to Auth0. So you can see here that we've performed a request to the authorized endpoint at Auth0. And this here is following the OAuth 2 protocol. Just as our authorization server that we've been using earlier does, it's specifying all the necessary information that we need in order for us to start this authorization request. And the authorized endpoint is what we use to initialize these different redirect flows. So we can see here that we are specifying our redirect URI, that we're requesting ID token and code, the different scopes, and that it's going to respond by doing a form post. So now we need to go into Auth0 and add the redirect URI to be able to approve this request. So we're inside the OAuth 2 dashboard and we've gone into our client. I'm going to scroll down here to the bottom and I'm going to change the allowed callback URLs. This here allows me to specify multiple different callback URLs. I'm going to save this here and now we can simply try and refresh the page here and we'll see that our request was in fact approved. So now we can say here that we can log into our social network. We can say that we want to sign up. We can say that we want to log in. And it allows us to log in using Facebook, Google, Twitter, and Microsoft, or using a local login. It even allows us to register. So we can try and register here and see what happens. I'm going to click sign up, and it redirected us back to signing-auth0. So you can see here, if we scroll down a little bit, we can see information in here about the user that just registered. We can see here that we get the token. We can see that it's a JOT, it contains our email, it contains the client ID, and it contains the avatar and picture and so forth. So it contains all this different information, but we still got a problem. It's telling us that the signature for this failed. So the problem here is that our middleware is expecting us to use a different type of algorithm to validate our token. So again, we need to jump over into Auth0 and change that in order for us to make this work. So go into the Auth0 dashboard, click into our social network client, scroll down to the bottom, go into our advanced settings, click on OAuth, and we want to change the JSON Web Token signature to RS256. Let's now change that. So let's jump over to the website and we need to redo the login and get the correct token passed to our web server. So we got redirected to Auth0 again here. We can see here that we're logging into social network, and it's telling us that the last time we logged in, we did that with mail@philipekberg.se. So I'll click this here. And look at that. It allowed us to authenticate with Auth0, and we're now authenticated and logged into our website. So that's pretty awesome. So it allowed us to register our new users. So earlier, when we used our own authorization server, we hadn't added that registration step. And we hadn't added all the different external providers. So using a service like Auth0 allows us to just out of the box get a lot of customizations and integrations with different providers. So this is totally flexible. Now, one of the problems here though is that you can see here that this token here at the top is not really looking like a correct token. And so far we haven't told our API to use Auth0. So there's a few things that we need to do. First, we need to go into Auth0 and specify our new API. So let's do that. In this demo, we'll be looking at securing our API with Auth0 authorization. We've now been able to log in using Auth0, and our website now knows that we are authenticated with Auth0. But now we want to be able to leverage an access token to make use of our API and prove that we are authorized to access some data. And earlier I told you to focus on the security implications of doing something like this with our application. And that will become a lot more clear now that we look at what it's going to do with our API. Because frankly, after this demo, you will be giving access to people's data inside your database, and you're allowing them to register on Auth0, and we're simply validating that by using the email, right? So I want you to think about how you can solve that and try and come up with something on your own. But now let's jump into looking at how we can secure our API by using Auth0 authorization. Now inside the Auth0 dashboard, we can see that we have one user, we can see that it just logged in, and we can click into APIs, and we can see a list of our APIs. So let's create a new API, and this is not setting up the actual backend API, it's simply a way for us to specify that particular resource, just like we did with the API resources when using Identity Server. So we'll call this Social Network API, and the identifier is our audience. So we'll say here that we'll point to our local API. And I know that our local API is running on that particular port, so we'll just simply specify that as the audience. So let's create this here. Now we can get information about how to use this in our actual API to say that it's going to use this authorization server to validate requests coming into our API. Now, if we do that, it's going to use Auth0 to validate the tokens that are being passed into this API. So let's go ahead and add that to our API, and then we'll fix the problem with our access token. So the way that we do this in our API is by going into our startup.cs, and we'll scroll down to configure. And earlier we said that this application is going to use Identity Server authentication, but we're no longer going to use Identity Server, so we won't be needing to use that particular middleware. Of course, if Auth0 was 100% compliant with the OAuth specification as well as the OpenID Connect specification and didn't diverge anything at all or add any criteria on its own, we would probably be able to use the same middleware. But we're going to use a different middleware, which is simply a way for us to say that we are using a JOT bearer authentication. So let's get rid of this here. We're going to say that we're using JOT bearer authentication. And then we'll specify the options. The first part is simply pointing to our API. It's specifying our audience. And that needs to match up exactly with what's going to be inside the tokens, as well as what we've specified in Auth0. And of course, next up, we need to point to which authorization server to use. And that's the same one that we specified for our website. Alright, so this here allows us to specify that we're now using JOT-bearer authentication. It's telling us that we are expecting the token to contain information that is directed towards this audience. And the audience is our API. So we'll have a token that's issued to be able to use with this API. And the authority where we can validate the token is our Auth0 server. So before we run the website in the API, there's one thing that I want to remove. Let's go into the website and see what that is. If you remember from earlier, we're running this refresh token async method here. I'm going to leave it up to you to re-implement this for Auth0. Remember that all it's doing is getting information from our authorization server. It's trading the refresh token for a new access token as well as a new refresh token. So I will leave this as an exercise for you to re-implement this to work with Auth0. But for now, I'm going to comment this out up here. And then we'll rerun both the API as well as our website. We can see here that we're still authenticated. It looks like we have an access token, but it looks very different from what we've had earlier. And of course, if we run /home/shouts, you'll see that it's not getting any data. It's throwing an exception. And I can tell you right now that it's because our API doesn't know how to approach this access token. The problem here is that there's a particular requirement from Auth0. And what's interesting here is that other providers like Stormpath, or if you're using Amazon Cognito, or any other provider out there, they might add their own requirements when it comes to things like requesting access tokens and doing authentication. And with Auth0, what happens is that when you're doing your authorization request, in order for you to get an access token, you also need to specify the audience. So the request that we looked at earlier in Fiddler, we could see that it didn't include the audience. And if we jump into the startup.cs for our web project, you'll see that there's no way for us to set the audience. And the reason that we don't specify the audience on our OpenID Connect authentication middleware is because it's not part of the standard. It's a way for Auth0 to allow you to separate your different APIs that you have registered in the same account. So we need a way for us to append the audience to our initial authorization request. And remember, different providers might use different methods. But in this case here, we need a way for us to intercept what happens when we redirect to our identity provider. And of course, there's a way for us to do that with our OpenID Connect authentication middleware. So we can set up an event here. There are multiple different events. We can set up the different OpenID Connect events to specify certain behaviors. You'll see here that we can intercept behaviors for when the authentication fails, when the authorization code is received, when there's a message received, when we redirect to the identity provider, when we redirect for a sign out, when there's a remote failure, when there's a remote sign out, when there's a ticket received, when there's a token response received, when the token is validated, and when we receive user information. So we can pretty much intercept anything that we want to do here. And the one that we want to intercept is when we are redirecting to our identity provider. So this here is a function that takes the redirect context. That's the context for what happens when we are going to be redirected to our authorization server, which in this case is Auth0. And then this here returns a task. But I'm not going to do anything asynchronous in here, so at the end of this, I'm just going to return a completed task. Now, before we redirect to our identity provider, I want to add the audience to our authorization request. And the way that I do that is by using the context to get access to the protocol message to set a parameter. And then of course, this is where our audience goes. And that needs to match up exactly like what we've specified inside Auth0, as well as what we specified inside our API. Alright, so I set up the audience. Let's rerun both the web app as well as the API and see what happens now. So we've been redirected to our authorization server. And let's jump into Fiddler and have a look at what kind of request that we just did to our authorization server. And really look at that. Our request now includes our audience, and the audience is pointing to our API. So let's jump over to Chrome again and have a look at what happens when we perform our login. So let's click that we're going to use the same user as before. It's now going to ask us if we want to grant access to access social network. So now that we specify the audience properly, we'll see this consent screen. So that's a great indication for us to know that it's working. So let's click yes here, and we're now redirected back to the website and we can see our access token. Notice here how it's not giving us a refresh token. That's because we haven't told our API within Auth0 that it's allowing us to do offline access. So if we go ahead and change that as well, of course we would see a refresh token here. So now let's see what happens when we run /home/shouts. So let's have a look at why that's not working. Let's jump into Visual Studio and add a breakpoint within our action inside our API and see what happens. So we got a breakpoint inside our shouts controller inside our API, and we've reached get async here, so we know that we're authorized. I'm betting here that we don't have the correct claim. So let's look at our claims that we get here. So as we see here, there's in fact no email address, which kind of makes sense then that it doesn't work. So what we need to do is a few things. We need to go into the OAuth dashboard because we can see here that there's no information here that identifies our user. Because normally we have that in our ID token. So we want to extend our access token to contain a little bit more of information. And there's a way for us to do that. We can add particular information to our access tokens when they're issued by Auth0. So let's jump into the Auth0 dashboard and add the email address to our access token. The way that we do that is by specifying something called a rule. So we can go into the rules section, we can create a new rule, and we can say here that this rule here will allow us to get the email address inside our access token. And then we write some JavaScript down here to specify that we want to inject that on our context. This here allows us to set the email on the access token on our current context. And there's plenty of information about how to change this and how to use the different rules in Auth0 to change behavior. Alright, so now we have a rule here that will allow us to get the email address added to our access tokens. So let's go ahead and re-authenticate with our Auth0 authorization server and inspect the token. I'm going to log in with the same user. And let's copy the access token. And we're going to jump over to jot.io and have a look at our token. And we can see here that our token now contains our email. Now, let's run this here with the debugger attached again and try and hit our API. So we hit the breakpoint inside Visual Studio and let's have a look at our different claims. So we see here at the bottom that we have a particular claim saying that we have our email address. It's looking a little bit different than we had before. So when we check for the type parameter, it's going to be something different. It's still the email address, but in this case here, it's identified as a little bit different than what we've seen in the past. So we need to change that as well. Now let's finally rerun this and see what happens. And look at that, we can now see the shouts for our current user. So we moved over to using Auth0 as our authorization server, which allows us to log in using Auth0 to be authenticated to use our website, and then we'll use an access token that is issued by Auth0 to talk to our API, and the API validates that we are authorized to get the data, and then we use the email address to look up our user record. And we did this fairly effortlessly. Knowing about OAuth and OpenID Connect makes this process a lot easier. And of course, knowing how to work with the different claims and access tokens and everything that's around OAuth and OpenID Connect will allow you to work with these different principles in a much more easy manner. And of course, at this point, you probably want to move your users across to Auth0 because, as you saw here, I signed up with an email address and I got access to a database, to an old database records of that user. And that's a potential security problem, but I'm going to let you figure that one out yourself. In this final module, we talked about how we can move across to a hosted OAuth provider. We talked about how we can use something like Auth0 to make it easier for us to introduce authentication and authorization using OAuth and OpenID Connect in our application. Frankly, It's really easy once we know how to work with OAuth and OpenID Connect to add this to our application. Even though we had to make a few smaller changes in order for us to make it work in our situation, I must say that I think this is pretty easy compared to what we might have done in the past. And one of the things that we noticed and talked about throughout this module is that certain services might diverge from the RFC. We saw that Auth0, for instance, they require us to pass the audience, while Identity Server doesn't for the authorization request. Of course, sometimes that can make it really difficult for us as developers to know what kind of things diverge in the different systems. But as long as we know the OAuth and OpenID Connect specifications, we'll be able to get pretty far with pretty much any given hosted OAuth provider. So even if Auth0 did diverge a little bit from the RFC here, it wasn't really that much that we had to add in order for us to make this work. And of course, we saw how easy it was for us to migrate to Auth0. And it would be equally easy for us to migrate to something like Stormpath, Amazon Cognito, or any other hosted OAuth providers out there. Even if they do diverge a little bit from the RFC, as long as we know our OAuth and OpenID Connect specifications, it'll be pretty easy for us to make sure that we can introduce whichever OAuth provider that we want in our application. I want to thank you so much for watching this course. It's been a pleasure teaching you about ASP.NET Core and how you can apply OAuth and OpenID Connect in such an application. I really hope that you got a lot out of this course that will allow you to introduce this in your own application. And remember, the RFC is going to be your best friend when implementing this in your applications. Please do feel free to reach out in the comments of this course, and we'll talk more about OAuth, OpenID Connect, and ASP.NET Core. So again, thank you so much for watching this course. It's been a pleasure helping you out, learning all about OAuth and OpenID Connect. My name is Philip Ekberg, and I'll see you in the next course.